What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe show, the home of Epic Conversations. And I'm the host of Epic Conversations.
Something's got to separate you from the rest. So you got to be willing to do whatever.
In my experience, Black men have struggles like having community with each other.
But she represents the mammy stereotype.
Now that was epic. I needed that. What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe show, the home of Epic Conversations, and I'm the host of Epic Conversations, 2018 Innovation Award winner, 2020 Best Podcast News Award winner given out by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. I also co-host and co-produce the only online show in the world for dads, fathers, and male caregivers that's sponsored by Dove Men Plus Care. And being part of that movement, we've reached out directly and indirectly to over 400,000 dads, fathers, and male caregivers around the world. As always, I'd like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. So let's get the housekeeping out of the way right quick, because we have a special friend coming on here today. I want to make sure that we are just focused on her, not on Dr. Vibe, all right? So as always, please subscribe to the Dr. Vibe show on YouTube and hit the notification button, and like the Dr. Vibe show on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And as always, if you want to advertise your business, product, or service on any of the platforms that I'm a part of, please feel free to email me at dr.vibe@thedrvibeshow.com. So a little background here. A little while back, a few years ago in the Greater Toronto area, all across the headlines, all across the news, African immigrant crisis it was big news all over the place. But now you don't hear much. Does that mean that the situation has been resolved? I don't think so. It's far from resolved. And this is why we're going to have a conversation about it today. And we have a wonderful friend that's going to be sharing with us today. Adaoma Patterson was born and raised in Winnipeg. Man, the Peg is a cold place. So I know she's tough in a good way, because people call it winter peg in the winter, but that's another conversation. Except for 6 years that her family spent in Jamaica, Adaoma has more than 25 years of progressive experience in the not-for-profit and public sectors, has served several roles as a volunteer and employee, and recently completed her Master of Arts in Leadership. Woo, very nice. From the School of Business and Economics at the University of Guelph. In 2022, she joined the United Way of Greater Toronto as Director of Community Service Investments, responsible for ensuring their investments support a strong network of more than 300 agencies in the Greater Toronto area who play an important role in the region's safety net. She has extensive knowledge in the non-for-profit sector, having supported numerous strategic planning processes and worked collaboratively to identify public policies and implement programs that positively impact vulnerable residents and communities. Adaoma has also served on several boards, including the Tamarack Institute for Community Engagement and the Jamaican Canadian Association. She currently serves as Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and Communities Committee of School of Medical Planning team at the Toronto Metropolitan University, which it's always weird, because for those, we used to know it Ryerson, but it's Toronto Metropolitan University. So let's forget all of this stuff and let's bring up to the digital stage Adaoma Patterson. What is going on?
I am well, Dr. Vibe. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
I'm looking forward to the conversation. And one of the funny things, we know of each other.
That's right.
So I don't know if we've met. It's been very brief, if we've met.
Yeah, I don't think so, but I do know, of course, Dr. Vibe and the show. I've seen a little bit of it live, like when I happen to log on, I know on the Fridays. So, and of course I've heard, so it's great. Like we finally connect.
It's about time.
Long overdue.
I'm not a one and done person, so I'm putting it out there in the digital space. If there's anything that I can assist you or the organization with, would love to collaborate or love to help us score goals and get wins.
Yeah, great. We're all about collaboration and convening, having difficult conversations and solving very complicated issues together. So
Absolutely. Just a little bit more about you. How did you land at the United Way? Because I know you more about JCA, and then
that's right.
someone told me, "Oh, do you know Adaoma?" And it was a lady who I know who spent a time there from her company, and you may know who I'm talking about. And said, "I know that name. What the?" So how did you end up wonderfully at United Way of Greater Toronto?
Yeah. So, it's really, life is, there are all these full circle moments. So I was working with regional government here in the GTA for 21 years. And I was thinking about, the next stage, what I wanted to do, something that I felt was really meaningful, where we could see the impact of our work in a more tangible way. And so I'd been involved in a lot of policy stuff with my former organization, particularly addressing poverty. And so we worked very closely with United Way at that time. And for many years, actually, that organization partnered with United Way on really trying to understand the impact of poverty on people's lives, and then what do we do? And we brought a bunch of players together. So that was one United Way connection. And then when prior to me becoming president of the JCA, I was on the board as executive secretary. And at that time, the Jamaican Canadian Association received United Way funding. And I was very involved in some transformation that happened at the Jamaican Canadian Association, creating CAFCAN social services, and then the separation of the two. And United Way was a really strong and supportive funder and partner. And so here I am, all these years later, through these other connections with United Way. The time was right in 2022. There was an opportunity and an opening. And so I am now Director of Community Investments here at United Way Greater Toronto. And, it's United Way is an important organization. Many people know United Way as a funder.
Yeah.
So as you said, we have a relationship with more than 300 agencies in Peel, Toronto, and York region. That's the geographic scale. So we're actually the largest United Way in the world.
Come on. Really?
I was so shocked when I heard that. Yes, we are the largest United Way in the world, because, of course, when you think about the population of Peel, York, and Toronto, that's a significant, right? That region is, is very large. And so United Way, though, is really about, it's about supporting those urgent needs through agencies. So people who need some kind of crisis support. So they're in a shelter, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So they've been evicted, or for whatever, lots of circumstances, people end up in a temporary shelter. People need access to food. Food has become so expensive, and so they use a food bank. Their children may be involved in an after-school program. So we fund all of those emergent, sort of urgent needs. But United Way is also really about system change. Like, what are the root causes of the need for a food bank? It's often income, and other things. And so we work to bring government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector together to think about solutions that really address longer term change. And so that's all of those things made it an ideal place for me to land. And every day is new learning. It's 3 years. I've been here 3 years, and I continue to learn. I have not yet been to all of the agencies, 300, a lot of agencies. And every year I embark and try to get out to as many of the agencies that we fund as possible.
Well, congratulations on all your successes. One other thing I want to ask you before we get right into the report: how do you manage it between the personal and professional life?
Good question. I think A couple of things. One is that the team at United Way is amazing, fantastic. My colleagues are so passionate, I have to say, and it's one of the consistent things you hear about United Way Greater Toronto. The culture within the organization is so positive and so supportive. We had two new staff members, two new individuals join our team about a month ago. And that was the first thing they said. It's like, everybody is so willing to help. Everybody's passionate about the work that they do. And, you don't find that culture everywhere. And I can attest to that, having worked in other spaces. So I think our team is competent. They're really knowledgeable about the sector. Many of them have worked in the nonprofit sector. They're passionate. They understand the issues. And so that's one thing. So that helps, of course, have a really great team. And I have always, like, growing up, I saw my mom, like, and my parents and the elders around, they worked, and then there was community work. And so we understood that the way to advance and really try and make sure that Black people had a space in Canada and in Winnipeg in those days was to be involved in community. And community was our safe space. It was a place for all of us, especially as children, where we connected our history with our present. It helped us to navigate experiences of racism and discrimination. And so community remains a big part, plays a big role in my heart. The Black community and various initiatives I continue to be involved in. And so, when you really enjoy what you do, right? It doesn't feel like work. And I find lots of ways to get that balance, what we now call work-life balance. I have amazing family, a great circle, and people at the JCA, all the JCA elders, are my family as well.
Would it be correct to say that you're in a moment in your journey that this is hard work, not hard work?
I would say, well, yes and no. So it's definitely hard work, right? Like I intentionally chose United Way for the reasons that I outlined. I really want to be in roles that allow me to have some impact, that center people, like put people at the center of decision making, that help to influence discourse and policy. And so that's a commitment that I've had for many, many years. The hard work is that systems change is tough. It doesn't happen easily. The minute you think, things are going in one direction that's positive for people who are vulnerable and racialized, Indigenous people, then something happens to gotta roll it back. And so if you're not vigilant, right, you always have to continue to do that work to make sure that the things that people need, the supports, addressing the root causes of poverty and marginalization, that those things don't get rolled back. So that's the hard work, because it ain't easy. And in this day and age, when there's so much distraction and so much noise, people are feeling anxious, coming out of the pandemic and now into a lot of political and social and economic upheaval, cost of living. People are struggling. And so we have to find ways, those of us who are in positions, to continue, right, to advocate for individuals, to make sure that the services and supports are there, and to have those uncomfortable conversations, do our part. So, it's a bit of both, but like what drives it, of course, is hard work.
All right, excellent. Well, let's get to some focus here.
Yes.
And we're here about this report, Understanding the Experiences of African Asylum Seekers in Peel, York Region, and Toronto. So my first conversation piece is, what prompted the United Way of Greater Toronto to commission or support the African Asylum Seekers report now?
Mm-hmm. In 2023, and you mentioned this in your introduction, we saw a crisis unfold really on television, in the newscast. And so a couple of things struck us. One is that, so we saw people sleeping on the sidewalks. We saw them in front of shelters that were full and could not accommodate people. And they were, Black people that looked like you and I, African asylum seekers who came, escaping all kinds of conditions. And Canada, is seen as that safe space, that place that will accommodate and support and allow people to live the life that they should live. But it wasn't really until Black organizations, Black agencies, and community leaders raised the alarm and the cry that people started to react. Systems started to react in a more intentional way. And United Way, we fund many organizations, as you know, including Black-led and serving agencies. And so we assessed at that point, what was our role in meeting those needs? At that time in 2023, the needs were all about emergency response, someplace to sleep, something to eat. Was crisis counseling needed? Was that person or family experiencing trauma? So it was all about kind of those basic needs. And United Way, that we jump in during times of crisis. And so we funded many Black-led and serving agencies and collaboratives that were already doing the work. So you saw that churches and mosques, they stepped up. That's not a core part of their work, but because shelters were full and others were slow to respond, they stepped up and did the work. People were sleeping on cots in a church basement, and I visited a number of those spaces. People were cooking and providing 24-hour care outside of their core business. And then organizations, agencies like Afghan Social Services, like African Community Services, who are in the business of social services, also were stepping up and collaborating with some of the grassroots agencies. And so we funded many of them, over 400,000. We basically got out the door in weeks, right? We were able to just provide a very simple assessment and application, and agencies were then able to buy gift cards. They were able to access clothing for people, other really critical supplies, personal items, and just help people navigate that period. So once we funded and the crisis started to wane a little, we then said, what is our role in understanding the broader need? What do people need? What are the gaps in the systems, the various systems and services that are offered by the different levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, plus our social services sector? What gaps exist? Why are people not able to come to Canada and then get into the network of services and supports that they need? And we met with our colleagues at the City of Toronto, the region of Peel, York region, our community as well, community leaders like Pastor Eddie Jumba and Debbie Douglas, Diane from St. Margaret's, who also were exploring and thinking about what is different from this wave of refugees and asylum seekers, what is the same, and why are we still struggling to provide those holistic supports to people? And so we landed on trying to understand the needs. A qualitative study, so not quantitative, because of course the federal government has numbers. They know how many asylum seekers were coming in, people are claiming asylum or refugee status. We wanted to put a face to the numbers and to the crisis that was unfolding on television, so that people understood that these are individuals who come with skills. They are a positive contribution to Canada, to our communities, but because systems weren't in place, because the services weren't in place in a coordinated fashion, they were falling through the cracks. And so we worked with the Center for the Canadian Center for Community-Based Research, They undertook the qualitative study, and it was community-based research. We formed an advisory group that included many of the agencies, Black-led and serving agencies who were doing the work. They advised us on, what this needed to accomplish, the way that we had to care for people who were sharing their experiences and their stories with us. And so that's really why we embarked on sort of what we call this sort of second phase. We met the immediate needs, and then we wanted to step back and say, to document people's stories and to understand from their experience, what were the things that were working for them and what were the things that weren't working for them.
You mentioned the involvement from the community. I want to bring up this conversation piece. How did community partners, frontline organizations, and people with lived experience shape this report?
Mm-hmm.
And what makes this methodology credible and community-centered?
Right. So, as I said, we chose an organization who is very experienced in community-based research. They are grounded in that type of research. The lead researcher from CCBR actually was an asylum seeker. So he has completed his PhD and is in that space of research. And so Jean was the lead researcher with his team. So that was the first thing. The second thing, as I mentioned, we formed an advisory committee, and they informed this research every step of the way through their understanding of the sector, understanding of people who were experiencing and going through the journey of asylum. They understood the service needs, the gaps. So they brought a lens that then informed what we did. One concrete example of that is, the advisory committee said it's very important for us to explore the impact of anti-Black racism, because that's one of the key things that would make this current group of asylum seekers different than previous ones, Ukrainians, Afghans, so it was really important that that lens was applied throughout the process. They also help to provide and find folks for us to interview, right? Because they are delivering the services, and so their staff are connecting directly to people who we wanted to hear from, and so there were a number of ways. Throughout the process, we interviewed 29 individuals who arrived within the last 2 to 3 years at the time. Who are African asylum seekers. They were currently residing in Peel, Toronto, or York, and sometimes people moved from one to the other, right, to be able to access the services and supports they needed. We also interviewed frontline workers who work in social service agencies, and a number of them have lived experience. They were able to relate to arriving here and then having to navigate a very complicated Canadian immigration system to try and get that approval or their claim accepted by IRCC. And so there were a number of ways, we really wove and make sure we were grounded in the experiences of the individuals that we wanted to include in this report.
To bring this to proper context, because I have a global audience, so can you define what we mean by African asylum seekers in this report, like countries of origin, typical migration pathways, and legal status distinctions? Asylum claimant versus refugee versus undocumented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. A lot there. So in this report, we focused on asylum seeker versus refugee in terms of language, but they're really similar. So someone who arrives in Canada and declares that they are seeking asylum, they are running or leaving from something because they are facing persecution or some kind of situation in their home country. We weren't sure at the beginning where people were coming from, so or the sort of where they were coming via, right? So IRCC tracked the sort of kind of top 5. They monitored over time 5 countries in Africa. Nigeria was sort of consistently number 1. So West African and East African countries really were the primary source countries for asylum seekers who started arriving in 2023. And then when you arrive, so if you land at Pearson International Airport or whatever airport, you say, I'm seeking asylum, and then there is a process that happens. The customs folks, you complete some paperwork, and then that's your initial documentation. Sometimes people came across a border. So we heard about Roxham border, I think, in Quebec for, that was in the news quite a bit. It's a more informal border. So people were walking across. And then some stayed in Quebec, some moved on to Ontario or other places and claimed asylum.
Yeah, good stuff. So as I look into this a little bit further, what are the unique challenges that African refugees face compared to other groups who want to come into this country, other newcomer groups?
Mm-hmm. I would say that really the thread when we talk to people was around the experience of racism, right? That was a common theme amongst all of the individuals or most of the individuals that were interviewed. And so that anti-Black racism would be unique. I think some things are in common. People who are experiencing asylum, it's very hard to navigate a system, all right? And so for your international audience, in Canada, all levels of government have some jurisdiction over this process and over folks who are claiming asylum or refugee status. So the federal government is responsible for immigration and policies around immigration and refugees. And so they set targets for immigration, for example, annually. They develop the rules, the high-level rules around who's a refugee. They process those claims. Those hearings are done at the federal level, right? So they end up determining, is this person's claim legitimate based on Canada's criteria? The provincial government is responsible for funding a lot of the social service programs that municipalities deliver. So social assistance, which we hear call Ontario Works, or some people call welfare, access to benefits, health benefits. In Ontario, it's OHIP, right? So when you go to the doctor, you give them a card, and that gives you access to primary care. So that's the provincial government, and there's some settlement in there as well. So they may fund organizations to help people settle. The federal government does that as well. But the federal government, when they fund settlement programs, it's for people who have already been accepted as a permanent resident, right? It's generally not, people who come and claim asylum are generally not able to access federal settlement programs. Some exceptions were made during the crisis and the period where, the volume of people coming in was so large, but generally no. And then the municipalities, so your city of Toronto or the regions, Region of Peel, York Region government, they are responsible for all of those services that you see. So shelter spaces, right? They're funded by the province to have emergency shelters. Shelters are supposed to be temporary. They're not a place for you to live, right? That's why they're called temporary shelters. They come in during a crisis. So someone is fleeing violence and they need to come into a shelter. And the idea is that then they would transition out into more affordable or permanent housing. Of course, we have a bottleneck with our shelter systems. And so many individuals, shelters have often been full since the pandemic. They've often been full. And so that's one of the things, the biggest challenge for asylum seekers or refugees is understanding how government impacts their lives. And every level of government plays a role. Like whether you can go see a doctor, that's a provincial thing. Whether you would have a shelter bed or you can get social assistance, that's a municipal or regional thing. And so the system is really complicated, even for those of us in the business and who have some familiarity with it. It is very complicated to navigate. And that's why our agencies, our organizations that do that frontline work are so important, because they're the ones that help people figure out, what can I get access to? Where do I go? And the sector, the nonprofit sector, the community sector, is often filling the gaps, right, between governments, because governments aren't often coordinated. They don't get sort of this seamless set of services right. And so that's why people fall through the cracks. And so we are, and sorry, I totally lost track of the question, but I do remember. So anti-Black racism was the biggest thing in terms of experience for African asylum seekers. There are other things like languages, of course. So when you're accessing services, are there people who speak the language that you speak? And sometimes we're using, even if they're speaking English, we are using English words in a way that makes no sense. So, for example, we talk about the settlement sector in Canada. What does that mean for people who don't live in Canada, right? Just so common words that we use, the translation. When we talk about mental health, for many Black people outside of Canada, mental health can come with a stigma. And so if you say, I think you should go and see a mental health counselor, right? There's often or sometimes resistance to that, because it means, oh, the person might think I'm crazy, So how do we form things in a culturally appropriate way? How do we use language that resonates with people so that it's not increasing stigma, and it's not preventing them from getting care because of how they perceive that. So I'd say those are some key differences. The report really highlights many things that are similar, but how we support African asylum seekers, some of the solutions that they came up with are different, right? Particularly around policy and access to service.
What are the 3 top insights or statistics that surprised you the most?
Okay, so I'm going to go back. So the research report, again, we interviewed 29 individuals, right? And I'll talk a little bit about, what we found. And again, we intentionally used a qualitative methodology because this was about amplifying the voices of people who are currently going through whatever experience. But I would say, I think what's really interesting as a more backdrop and context is that in November of 2024, the federal government reduced their immigration targets. Up to November of 2024, Canada was on a very ambitious plan to increase the number of immigrants. And actually in 2023, IRCC indicated that our population was 41 million and immigration accounted for 98% of the growth, right? So Canadians are not, so Canadians, are not having children. And so our growth really comes from immigration. So immigration has always been a key strategy for driving the economy. However, there were some challenges, not just with asylum seekers, like from a government perspective, not just with asylum seekers, but also the number of permanent residents and international students and temporary workers. Because of the cost of housing, high cost of housing and high cost of living in the GTA, many people were struggling. International students would come in and they just were not able to sustain themselves through the duration of their learning. Temporary workers, a similar thing. And so they rebalanced and reduced, actually. So the original plan was 500,000 permanent residents In 2025, they've reduced that to 395,000. And the following year in 2026, they've reduced it to 380,000. So the numbers are of permanent residents, people that will be accepted, right, is decreasing. And so, of course, that has a ripple impact. One, though, for those who are applying directly as permanent residents, but potentially others who are already in the country, either to temporary work permits or perhaps asylum seekers. You know, like, what does that mean for the overall numbers that can be accepted? We don't know. And so we have that as the backdrop in terms of data. People run for a reason or flee for their home country for a reason. And so the more disruption and turmoil through war and climate change and other things that happen in other countries, the more likely we're going to continue to get an influx of refugees, because people just want the opportunity to do what you and I are able to do. Live peacefully, you know, support our families, have a meaningful life, career, etc. In this research report, what we heard from people was that they just wanted that opportunity. The asylum claim process is very lengthy. There is a wait list. And so it means that people's lives are potentially on hold, you know, for long periods of time. Access to affordable housing is a crisis still. We don't hear as much about it now because of other conversations, but access to affordable housing is critical. Safe, affordable housing. Sometimes people are living, they've moved out of the shelter and they are living somewhere, but it's not necessarily the safest place for them, right? It's the only place that they can get. So all of the asylum seekers spoke about access to affordable housing, the ability to pay rent. Some of them talked about perceptions and racism and discrimination in the interview process for work and jobs. They talked about racism in housing. So when they would show up to a place, the landlord said, no, I'm not renting to, you know, an African refugee, right? And so they shared those experiences, those anecdotal experiences. So the combination of inability to get a meaningful job, a job that will pay your bills, access to affordable housing, you know, the right supports that you need at the right time, people who understand the kind of trauma that you've experienced, culturally appropriate care where people can feel like, oh, someone understands me, understands my culture, understands how I perceive healthcare, mental health, all of that. All of those things we heard in varying degrees from the people that were interviewed and from the frontline workers who talked about the need for culturally appropriate care, right? Informed trauma care, whether it was being delivered by a Black-led and serving organization, and it was more likely to be delivered by them in that manner, or mainstream organizations who were delivering services. Did they really understand who was in front of them? Those are the things that made the experiences different. And those are some of the things we heard.
What are the mental health and family impacts, especially for children and youth?
Oh, sorry, did you say what are the impacts?
What are the mental health and family impacts of this situation, especially for the children and youth?
Right. So when we talk to our agencies, our community partners, we know that the longer it takes for someone to get settled, right, to find housing, safe, secure housing, to have their children in school, you know, learning and getting integrated, making friends, to be part of a community, the longer that that process takes, is the more likely that those individuals will take a lot longer time to settle. Issues of mental health become more pronounced the longer that you are in a temporary space. Okay, if you're in a shelter for 3 months versus a shelter for 9 months, it makes a difference. Okay, a shelter is not intended to be a place that you stay, you sleep for months and months. And so the solution is to help people transition as quickly as possible, meet people in Canada, in their community, get them the services they need. One of the other things that we heard is that because many of the lawyers through legal aid and legal services, community legal services, are the ones that help people process the application and make the claim, they are so overwhelmed that people felt like they weren't getting the attention and time on their case, right? They weren't getting sufficient attention and time. And so mental health is a big one. People become stuck in a cycle of social services if we don't work with them to move quickly. And that includes their children and youth. Children and youth are particularly vulnerable because they're coming at an age and they're entering a whole new society, a new culture, at a time where they're already going through a lot as a teenager. And so just that transition and that ability to fit in, they may have gone may have been out of school for some time. So the ability to catch up and not to be seen as kind of the other. All of those things impact people. And so it's really important that the community sector and different levels of government remove barriers that keep people in kind of a cycle of temporariness, if that's such a word, I'm making up the word, as possible.
And how has the shelter system handled the surge? How did it handle it initially compared to what's going on now through your report? What have you found findings-wise?
Mm-hmm. So I think initially, all of the shelter systems, I think we could safely say, were overwhelmed. Again, they were already stretched because of COVID, right? And coming out of COVID. So people on the streets for many, many reasons. You saw encampments, right? You saw lots of people living in parks in the Toronto area and the GTA. And actually encampments are still an issue. So people are sleeping in parks. They don't feel safe in the shelter. There are lots of reasons why they may not want to go to the shelter. But the shelters were just overwhelmed and full. Shelter capacity is a bit better now. I think what has happened since this report and over the last, say year, now that there's been a slowdown and an ability to kind of pause and revisit how you're delivering services, is that municipalities working with community agencies are trying to move people out of the shelter system faster, moving into transitional housing or helping people find safe and affordable housing. I think the government has also enabled some of that. So for example, the federal government last week or the week before made an announcement that the region of Peel would receive more than $100 million to support asylum seekers and refugees in transitioning into more permanent housing kind of within 90 days. So those are some of the things, like what are the tools that government has? Much of it is things like rent sub, right? Subsidizing rent for a period of time, because in Toronto, like who can afford rent? Like virtually very few people can afford rent. So how do we help people get into the housing market and have a place to live? So offering things like a rent supplement, but working with people, right? So having someone support them in figuring out what are they able to access, and then to actually get access to those services that help them move along farther.
You had mentioned earlier on about the anti-Black racism piece. What harmful myths or misinformation should we challenge directly when it comes to this subject?
That African asylum seekers are a drain on the economy, right? Because we were hearing stories all the time about the cost, the federal government spending millions and millions of dollars on hotel spaces. So those narratives contribute to some perceptions. And so what we say through this report and through as many channels as we can are that the African asylum seekers, like other asylum seekers, are a benefit to our community. What they need is some initial supports to get up and running, but they come with skills, education, and experience. As I said to you before, in 2023, immigration accounted for 98% of growth, right? So Canada needs people to come to keep our economy going. So that narrative that asylum seekers, it's always about a drain and what we're having to give them, I think needs to be challenged, in as many ways as we can. Because people, once they're able to get on their feet, they're off and running. They will work, they'll take any job, they contribute, they want to be part of a community. And so it's important that we continue to tell stories and then challenge those myths that it's about, a handout or it's a one-way exchange. It is definitely not a one-way exchange.
So many things, but so little time. So let me ask this. What has the United Way learned about the coordination between mainstream agencies and Black-led, Black-serving, and Black-focused organizations?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So a couple of things. Several years ago, United Way realized that we were not funding a sufficient number of Black-led and serving agencies. And over the course of the past couple of years, we've intentionally increased our investments to agencies like CAFCAN, African Community Services, Roots Community Services, so many, C Center for Young Professionals, so many Black-led and serving agencies. Historically, the literature tells us, the research tells us that Black agencies have been underfunded compared to mainstream agencies. And so we've been very intentional about addressing that issue. We also learned that it really was Black-led agencies who moved quickly, who were able to shift and come in and do what was needed at the time. And so it's important that we recognize their value and the important contribution they made. They are the ones who understood what certain foods mean to people, how food brings comfort. They were the ones who provided space for people to be able to share, not just about addressing like those immediate needs, but also things that brought them joy, right? Like you need a break sometimes from the heaviness of life, coming together, creating women's circles, spaces for children and young people to just be, and to feel a part of something bigger. Black-led agencies led the charge there. And so the report highlights, the importance again of having agencies that understand the needs of the specific population and can be at the table to inform how services should be delivered, what people need. And so many agencies did work, and we encouraged, collaboration between some of our mainstream agencies and others. And I can tell you, just by way of example, once we released the report, we announced some funding to 2 collaborative projects, one in Peel, led by African Community Services of Peel, and one in Toronto, led by CAFCAN Social Services. And they are working with mostly other Black-led and serving agencies, but also others to create wraparound care for asylum seekers, to do that in a more coordinated way, to think about how to connect folks to employment, how to connect folks more seamlessly to mental and other social health services. So Black Creek Community Health Center is one of the partners with CAFCAN, and they're a mainstream agency. And so thinking about the learning that happens, the shared learning through collaboratives, thinking about the importance of Black-led and serving organizations in an ecosystem and in something that provides more wraparound services. And I know City of Toronto, just by way of other example, in the last couple of months, they issued a request for proposal for a Black-led agency to lead a Black-focused shelter that is in their plans in the next couple of years. All of those things came out of recommendations and dialogue with Black organizations between 2023 and now, right? They identified clearly where the gaps were and why they matter and why they should be at the table along with other organizations.
We'll accelerate here because I know your time is waning. Okay, I'm going to approach it this way and we'll do some rapid fire here. Some calls to action. So what would be a call to action for each level of government in regards to this situation that you would like to see?
So at the municipal level, it's ensuring that when the next wave happens, because it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, that their systems are more prepared. So again, those emergency services, the shelter services, all of the access to information, et cetera. So the plan, having a plan that's in place to be able to deal with surges as they arrive, a surge of people as they arrive. I would say provincially, it's investing in organizations to deliver services, settlement services, but also to those who maybe have no status or are claiming asylum, and to fund those, right, sufficiently and adequately, including Black-led and serving agencies. Federally, it's really around the policies. So improving the time that a claim takes so that someone's life is not in limbo for lengthy periods of time. So improving that processing time so that people can have their hearing done in a reasonable time. And thinking about the services that they do fund, ensuring, again, that they're funding community sector sufficiently to be able to support people in the way that they need, and so that they can move quickly through services.
Next group, employers.
Well, employers have a big role to play, and that, we definitely, it's concerning for us to hear about racism, experiences of racism, people being told outright that they're not going to be hired because of their status and because of how they look and where they're from. And so it's really incumbent on employers to make sure that they are being fair and that they're providing opportunities to people who do need that entry level or other position. So, checking bias throughout their hiring process, giving young people, an opportunity, that summer job, et cetera, or that part-time job. That's their role, right? Is to hire and to consider hiring people that reflect the folks that buy their products and their services.
Or funders and donors.
So funders, and so I include United Way in that. One is to make sure we are sufficiently funding Black-led and serving agencies. And we think about their role in a broader ecosystem of social services and community services, that we're building their capacity, because that's what they've told us, that they need the investment, both resources and money and funding, to build their capacity to do this work in a larger way and to scale this work. And so funders and indirectly donors who give money to funders, find ways to support. Employers can also support through mentorship, internship, and many of our donors actually, companies do some of that, but to do more of that and to help create awareness about the experiences that African asylum seekers, the things that they're experiencing. So long-term sustainable multi-year funding and investment is really key to building the capacity of Black-led and serving agencies.
For the broader general public, what's your call to action?
I think it's really important that as individuals, that we take the time to understand the issues, that we don't fall into a narrative of us and them, right? Particularly as things become economically challenging, there is a tendency to create more of this us and them narrative. And I think residents, Canadians, have a role to play in the spaces that are welcoming, making sure whether that's a community center or a community neighborhood organization or association, volunteering, getting to know folks, thinking about programs that allow them to connect to others and to people who are newcomers, to asylum seekers, find ways to shift the narrative, because really on an individual level, that is our role, is not to contribute to false narratives or negative narratives that really keep people vulnerable and marginalized.
What's a success look like in 12 months and in 3 years?
All right. Well, in 12 months, success is that more people who are still not permanently housed, more asylum seekers who are still in sort of temporary or precarious positions, housing situations, that they are finding space, that they are further along in that journey of being of the asylum seeker process. In 3 years, that should there be another wave, that governments are much more coordinated, that there is a response that is logical and that can actually work to support people in a much faster way. That would be the ideal. And I would say the other thing in the next year and 3 years is that the investments, the funding by the various levels of government continues to sustain this work, and that budget pressures that we are seeing and hearing about at the federal and provincial level does not mean it's at the expense of the people who actually need it.
Two last quick things. First of all, since you mentioned funding, what's one program you'd double the funding for immediately, and why?
We have, well, a good question. So United Way is, we are deepening our investments in two areas that are critical, and it actually came up through this conversation. One is housing stability, right? So we are and plan to, as a part of our new 2035 strategic plan, wanting to make a bigger impact or have a bigger impact on housing stability, people's ability to connect to housing, because it's not just about the infrastructure. That's a big part of it, like having that place to live, but often it's also about the supports, making sure that people can sustain the housing they get. And so for us, housing stability is a critical piece. If you can stabilize housing for people, the other pieces are a bit easier to get in place, right? Without housing, it's hard to work. If you're worried, if you don't have a place to sleep at night, like getting a job makes it that more difficult. And then the other piece is around financial stability. So access to the income support programs, the types of work that allow you to pay the rent. And so those two things are really like the cornerstone for us, housing stability and financial stability. And so that is where we are deepening our investments in the coming years.
Maybe think of two more quick things real quick. One is, how will you ensure the report doesn't sit on the shelf? What's the accountability plan?
Yeah, that's great. So part of that, of course, is getting out there and sharing the findings and the recommendations. So with the general public, we've been talking a lot to communities about this work and why it's important. And also convening with our government, our municipal partners, the community service sector and private sector, to understand, okay, what has changed since 2023? So is there anything you're doing differently? And then based on the recommendations, are there opportunities for us to come together to work to address, one or more of the 29 recommendations in the report? So the report is a living thing. The report informed our current funding, additional funding to African Community Services and Kafkan Community Services for, continued wraparound supports for asylum seekers. And then we're exploring and talking to those partners that I mentioned about, what their next steps are and then how we work together.
And finally, on a high note, what's one story that keeps you going?
So Jeff Masangi at African Community Services shared a couple of stories. One is someone who was diagnosed with cancer after arriving here. And yes, and so he's okay now.
Good.
But really, African Community Services sort of wrapped he and his family, wrapped around he and his family, making sure that he had the healthcare he needed, that he was able to navigate that in a really, really challenging time, get the access to healthcare, and then the other supports, food, worked with him to stabilize and get somewhere safe and affordable to stay. And so he has now come back and is volunteering.
Wonderful. That's joy.
Yes. Lots and lots of good. And people are so eager, right? As soon as they land on their feet, they want to give back, right? And again, that speaks to, the fact that they are positive contributors to our communities and not a drain, as is sometimes told.
I think that's a wrap on that story. Adaoma, I want to say thank you so much for taking the most important thing in your life, your time, to share with our family. And it's you hit it out of the park, out of bounds.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate Dr. Vibe. Thank you for this platform and for the opportunity. It's really important that despite lots of noise that's happening, that we talk about the things that matter.
Absolutely.
And that's you are focused on the things that matter. And so thank you very much.
Appreciate that. There is a report, Understand the Experience of African Asylum Seekers in Peel, York Region, and Toronto. The link is there. I'll share it out in the on the comments or in the description of this epic conversation. Also, if you want to get a hold of this great organization, the United Way of Greater Toronto, there is the website, UnitedWayGT.org, the largest United Way in the world.
I know.
That is out of bounds. Not like this, how you said over that. I thought, what?
I know. That's what when I hear, I still I still pause when I hear that.
Wrap it up here. Subscribe to the Dr. Vibe Show on YouTube and hit the notification button. Subscribe to the Dr. Vibe Show on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. If you want to advertise your business, product, or service on any of our shows, please reach out to me, dr.vibe at the drvibeshow.com. And also, if you want to find out with me, simple link, taplink.cc/the Dr. Vibe Show. Also, too, if you want to catch replays of this epic conversation, you can catch them on the Dr. Vibe Show on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and the Dr. Vibe Show website. And such a great conversation today. Such a great conversation today. But this is what we do. We end it off. Live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. Block assumptions. Aim bigger, aim better, aim higher, aim wider. Love, faith, and respect. Don't just manage your time, manage your energy. Remember to give yourself grace. And if you're not making money, make history. Try to do both and make it better. God bless. Peace well. Keep the faith and walk good. Wow.
Yep.
I feel like I'm in class with Dr. Alicia. That's a class I wouldn't skip. There's some other ones I'd like to skip, but I'm glad I'm not skipping this class tonight. So I'm hoping you're catching this live, but if not, certainly catch it on the replay because this is good stuff that Joe is laying down here. Get ready. When I saw this today, I said one word. Aya!
Did you really?
No. I felt like it's an incredible document that I'm going to suggest that you take and use as a lecture piece wherever you want to go?